kind of stuff, you'll know you're in the right place. So like I said, this is what we're going to do. We're going to talk about preparedness, response, and recovery to these kind of incidents. We have found over time that this can occur anywhere, right? This type of attack is not specific to any place, people, time, you name it. So trying to think that it can't happen here or to me or at this time is not practical. I can tell you that I've been doing this job long enough where we initially started out dealing with critical infrastructure. What we figured was the most important stuff that kept our society going. Well, a lot of that stuff is already federally regulated, right? The last thing they want is another Fed coming in and giving them good ideas. Also, the bad guys weren't attacking those places. They were attacking houses of worship, nightclubs, movie theaters, you name it, right? And so that's who we are doing more and more work with. Schools for sure in that as far as that goes. There is no profile as far as shooters go. Let's see if we can. That's handy. Okay. So I really encourage you not to try and get a picture of what you think the adversary is, because it spans a wide mark. If you're responsible for planning for this, the FBI has put out reports that are wonderful. And a Google search for FBI active shooter reports will put you in the ballpark for that. And they span from 2000 to 2018. And the statistics in there are wonderful, really good for planning, and I'll reference a lot of that stuff as we go here. So as defined by DHS, and I agree with this, I'll argue with a little bit as we go, but it is murder in progress, right? I really do not like the term active shooter, right? Because what's an active stabber? What's an inactive shooter, right? But it's the term that we landed on, right? So it doesn't make a whole lot of sense, and we're trying to change it, but we haven't found a good marketing term for that. But for the sake of the conversation, when I say active shooter, I would like you to translate that to murder in progress. And the important part of that is that it's immediate. Like, it is going on right now. And if you don't act, things are probably not going to go your way. And that is an important point to drive home, and we'll keep talking about that as we go. Random or systematic shooting spree or some other kind of attack, right? We've certainly seen more than our fair share of edged weapon attacks, vehicle as a weapon, any of those kind of things. The fact of the matter is, it's a surprise attack. Militaristically, it's an ambush, right? That is, kind of the consistent theme in all of this is they will carry out the most efficient attack possible. The vast majority of these attackers are not highly sophisticated military operators, right, with advanced things. Aurora Theater, for example, is a one-off. It is such an anomaly that we are still studying it to this day. The degree of planning, the amount of material that was acquired, the sophistication of all of that was unheard of. Most of this is very basic kind of things, taken in opportunities with very rudimentary tactics and weapons. So bear that in mind. As far as the way these events last, that's being very generous. 10 to 15 minutes, it's closer to 5. These are so fast that, again, immediate action is what is required. This is not a deliberative process. This requires just that kind of spontaneous action. Militaristically, we've known this for a while, right? If you study Napoleon or any of that kind of stuff, in an ambush, the only proper response is an immediate counter-assault. Now, that's not what we expect y'all to do, but that immediate action is very important because this is a timed event. And we're also working against really bad training, right? For years and years, I'll get to you just so. We're fighting the fire drill, right? What happens, what is supposed to happen during a fire drill, right? Fire alarm goes off, what are you supposed to do? In a calm, orderly fashion, exit the building, and go to the designated ambush point, right? Really not a good idea. Does not apply to this. And we've had these conversations with folks, especially immediately following a lot of these events, especially if it's a new type of venue, right? The attacker has chosen something unique. For example, when the Sikh temple was attacked. That was a part of society that we had never interacted with before. And so trying to have a conversation and trying to understand their culture and limitations and how they do things was very challenging. And so understanding that and making that work is a lot of what we do, trying to overcome some of the ingrained cultural existence, if you will. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I don't want to dispute what you said when you referred to
Go ahead.
rudimentary or elementary weaponry. The cases like in Poway or Pittsburgh, these people walked in with very substantial weaponry and ammunition.
Okay.
That's one part of the problem, is that it was not rudimentary. You could get off a lot of shots. And the only reason that Poway didn't end up worse was because the gun, as powerful and large as it was, it jammed, so it couldn't get off shots. But it was not a rudimentary weapon.
It was not sophisticated militaristically. There were multiple people with a variety of weapon systems, and that's more what I was getting at. Those kind of firearms are devastating, without a doubt. What I was, and thank you, I'll clarify. The degree of sophistication, the use of explosives, for example, is very rare. Most of the firearms that are used were purchased legally. They're not modified in any way, so they're not suppressed, they're not automatic. Again, that's why Las Vegas was so much of an eye-opening, right? Because they've used a commercially purchased addition to a weapon that gave it the effect of automatic fire, which militaristically is a very advanced kind of thing. And so that, thank you very much, but that's what I'm getting at as far as that. So it is generally one, maybe two people with firearms, as opposed to anything more sophisticated than that. So the intent is obviously murder, and how that happens is fairly straightforward, and we'll talk about the pathway to violence here in a second. So from a preventative perspective, and coming from my background, I can tell you that these things, in general, are preventable. In most cases, for that person who attacked the organization, and again, if you want to look at the FBI reports, the majority of attackers were or related to the facility, right? So they know, to a certain degree, how it's laid out, how many people are there, what are their busiest times, those kind of things. And so it is not uncommon for folks to have some sense that this is going to happen. And what we're trying to do is create that intervention, right? Where historically, we have not wanted to meddle in others' business, right? It's not my job to get involved with that. We're trying to turn that just a bit, right? Paying attention to folks in crisis and taking some kind of action is proving to be where the rubber meets the road for us. I've done quite a bit of work with school security following Parkland. I mean, I've been doing it for decades now, but specifically following Parkland, and we're finding that that's the major piece as far as that mental health awareness and the appropriate application of it to folks in crisis. And so that's where we're at when it comes to prevention. I'll talk about pathway to violence here in a second, but I need to put it in context because I disagree to a certain extent where DHS gets involved, and we'll talk about it here in a second, because it's almost too late. So from a negotiator standpoint, the majority of folks that carry this out, the majority, right? And again, see the FBI reports, the majority of folks that carry out these attacks have no history of violence or criminal history, right? So if your profile of the attacker is the homicidal maniac, any of those kind of things, it's generally not the case, right? Again, folks like to gravitate to the Aurora Theater shooting, that kind of stuff. These folks tend to not be that. And so the point of that is to drive you to consider folks in crisis. And by crisis, we are defining that as an ordinary person, either going through or having gone through a traumatic event with an inability to cope and a lack of support. Those four things, when present, make the probability of an attack like this likely, right? Ordinary person, traumatic event, Inability to cope and a lack of support are very important. Yes, sir.
Hasn't that always existed in society? Why is it not included in society?
I'm sorry?
Haven't those factors always existed in society?
Yes.
Why now is it becoming so violent? Someone control it?
So, in Jeff Murray's opinion, and this does not reflect the views or opinions of the Department of Homeland Security, federal government in any way, we've had a mental health problem in our country and in society in general for a very long time. It's been stigmatized, and people aren't willing to address it. And so, we've let that fester, and then there's never one thing that is ever the problem. When you have a problem, it's not just one thing. But that inability to access mental health, especially from a crisis perspective, for anybody and everybody, is a real problem, right? And I can tell you that from my law enforcement background as a negotiator, the vast majority of the negotiations that I ever conducted were folks in crisis, right? And we'll talk about that. So any of these things can cause the source of crisis. And so DHS has what's called the pathway to violence, and it's very good, but it has some holes in it. The first of which, well, we'll talk through the pathway and then kind of go from there. So, as described, a person in crisis, for lack of a better term, is panicking, right? I have this problem, I don't know how to solve it. It is having some massive negative effect on my life, whether real or imagined, and I don't know how to solve it, and at some point I may consider it is someone else who's causing that problem for me. They are the root of the problem, whether it's a singular person or a group of people, right? And so, to help that planning process, they collect grievances, right? There is this real or imagined thing that has happened to me, and it is driving my planning. They call it violent ideation, but that's the plan. Based on my perception of these grievances, now I have a plan of action. Which isn't, from a person with good coping skills, coping well with a traumatic event. It's a matter of, here is a calm, rational way that causes no harm to anybody else. But in crisis, where I'm not equipped for this kind of thing, it's an irrational response to that. And so, as it's listed here, it's violent ideation. But this isn't a linear thing, right? I'm in crisis, I'm looking for a solution. There are other plans that you can use. There's nonviolence, right? I may not be coping well, but I'm going to steal, sabotage, destroy, deface, any of those kind of things, the possessions of the people that I see as my enemy, if you will. I can also opt out, right? The worst of which is suicide, but there is also disassociation from society, right? I'm going to move to the deserts of New Mexico and live in an RV. Right? I'm just checking out from society because I can't deal, and that's the way that works. And so, there's forks in the road as it applies to this. When they take that violent solution to their real or perceived problem, the problem is this is not an easy interval, right? It's not 10 minutes or 2 days between each thing. It picks up speed as you go. And so, by the time you might see somebody collecting grievances, making statements of a violent nature, I can't encourage you enthusiastically enough to get involved, because there is no telling how long that person has before they take action. So this is a bit of the culture change too. Right? I hope that you've seen some of our If You See Something, Say Something campaign material, but I strongly believe in that. And this is where that comes into play. If something doesn't look right, not saying something doesn't make it better. Because once they start the research and planning, again, in most cases, not all, the person is, was, or related to the facility. So the planning that is necessary, because they're not doing some very sophisticated military attack, might not take very much. The pre-attack preparation, again, doesn't need to be very sophisticated, and then the probing and breaching is the very last step before the attack. Yes, sir?
You said a couple times that the perpetrator is related to the environment or to the destination. Is that true in synagogue or religious attack?
Yes, in general, they've been to know somebody that goes to, may have been a member of, and I'm not typing that, but in the attacks in general, that's where that comes from. Now, I imagine for the attacks at any of the houses of worship, especially when it was hate crime related, and that's less so, but I wouldn't rule that out. The majority of these types of attacks have a domestic nature. So there can be some divorce, any of that kind of stuff can also be a factor to this. So please don't make this just related to hate crimes. Yes?
So is law enforcement overseeing social media, is the police, the FBI, or we often see that this starts, they do their rants on social media. Does somehow the FBI get involved in that? Are they always looking over that kind of stuff?
Yes. They are. And it's a matter of, you'll have declared and open Plan, Aryan Nation, those kind of organizations are very much on the radar of the Bureau. The challenge is, in a lot of these cases, and here is the challenge of social media, right? And this was the thing when the Islamic State came to be, that really freaked me out. Because I've been dealing with counterterrorism and working in counterterrorism since the mid-90s. And forever, for as long as there's been like the modern era of terrorism going back to Munich, all the terrorist organizations had hierarchy. There was a leader, and there were sub-leaders to that, and you were in a group, and you were responsible for operations, and you were responsible for logistics, and here's how all that went, which made them very easy to exploit. Right? You recruit an asset, you had some kind of part of that, you would follow the chain up to the top and eliminate the top, destabilize the organization, and that would fall apart. It worked fairly well. When the Islamic State put out their announcement and said, come one, come all you have to do is declare allegiance to us, and you're on the team. And if you do that and then attack, we will hold you up as a martyr, and you will have all the benefits that go to that. Now, that might not sound like a lot to you, but in the counterterrorism business, I broke down in a cold sweat. Because that mobilized anybody and everybody, anyone on the fringes, can now become a full card-carrying member of a terrorist organization. That was horrendous. And so, we do try and track, this is a very long answer to a very short question, but it's a big deal, right? We try and track as much of this, and law enforcement works, and not just the federal level, state and local are all doing extremist investigations. They are monitoring social media for content. The providers, Facebook, Snapchat, Twitter, are all being encouraged to eliminate hate speech on their websites. How successful that is. The problem is those organizations can communicate and radicalize folks, but they'll never meet. Those organizations, you're not vetted anymore. You know, where there's a time where you had to be a true believer, and we were going to test and indoctrinate you, and there was training that you had to go to, and all of that. Now it's like, I'm in, okay, you're in. That was it. And they didn't care. So that is a huge change in the way we do business. And from the counterterrorism perspective, it's challenging. Please.
Based on what Doris has asked you, so if these people someone doesn't have a record of violent behavior in the past, but they're doing something that we wouldn't approve of on social media, the FBI may be looking at them, but there's oftentimes we find that, this was going on, but we don't find out about it until after they've taken action. The question might be, how actively involved does the FBI or other law enforcement agency get in terms of doing something about that person before they act? Or can they not?
yes, no, and maybe. Right? I'm being glib,
No, I
but
understand.
the issue, so here's the issue. First Amendment, right? I can say whatever I like, to a certain degree. And those that make that speech are very talented, right? They understand what they can say and can't say, and everybody knows how to read between the lines when they want to be on the team. And so there's a line, and from a law enforcement perspective, you don't want us to cross, right? You really don't want law enforcement engaging in enforcement against speech to a certain point. And that is part of the challenge, right? We also don't have enough in the way of resources to do the investigations to the degree that they need to be done. So we only work off of the evidence that we have. If we don't have enough evidence and it's not readily available, there isn't very much that we can do. Now, law enforcement is limited, right? On the intelligence side, there's a little more that can be done because we're not prosecuting cases. We are building up networks and figuring out who belongs to who and who's saying what to whom, and so having a sense of that. But again, it doesn't take much, right? If I am a paranoid schizophrenic and I don't have access to healthcare to the degree that it keeps my condition in check, and I can't fulfill my prescription, I can have an episode, go online, join the organization, take my dad's firearm, go to the mall, go to town. And there's almost nothing that we can do as far as that goes from a law enforcement perspective. And this is why the whole, if you see something, say something, is really our best effort at this point, right? From my background, I think there needs, and again, my opinion does not reflect the user opinions. The mental health piece is horrendous. There's this massive gray area of folks that need substantial and acute mental health care that don't have access to it, that don't want it or can't get to it. And that creates a huge issue. On top of that, the way this is structured makes it very difficult. So again, kind of roundabout answer, but it's a very complicated circumstance, and there's no one person that has all the keys, right? And so there's that team bit. So